July 16, 1950. The largest crowd ever officially recorded at a World Cup match is packed into Rio de Janeiro's new Maracana Stadium. Brazil does not need to win. A draw against Uruguay will make the host world champion for the first time. The newspapers have already printed victory. Politicians have already delivered congratulations. Brazil has scored 13 goals in its previous 2 games. Everything about the day feels less like a contest than a coronation. The official attendance is 173 to 150, while many accounts place the number inside above 200,000. Brazil leads 1-0 early in the second half. Uruguay equalizes. Then Alcides Ghiggia runs down the right and approaches goalkeeper Moacir Barbosa. Everyone expects the cross. Ghiggia shoots inside the near post. The ball reaches the net, and a stadium built to amplify a nation's confidence becomes famous for its silence. Uruguay wins 2-1 and takes the trophy. No World Cup has ever ended like this one. None ever will again. But Brazil 1950 is larger than one terrible second. It is the story of football returning after a world war, a country building the biggest stage it could imagine, a tournament nearly emptied by withdrawals, England learning that it did not own the game, and Uruguay understanding that courage can change the sound of history. The World Cup had been absent for 12 years, and 2 expected editions were lost. The 1942 World Cup was canceled because the Second World War made a global football tournament impossible. The 1946 World Cup was also not held. The war had ended only the previous year. Countries and transport systems were devastated, and FIFA did not have the time, stability, or resources to organize qualification and a finals tournament. So the sequence was brutally simple. France 1938, no World Cup in 1942, no World Cup in 1946, and finally Brazil 1950. When FIFA met after the war, its first challenge was not simply to schedule another event. It had to prove that countries could travel, organize, and gather again. At the 1946 FIFA Congress, the trophy was formally named for FIFA President Jules Rimet, who had driven the competition from idea to institution. Brazil was selected to host the next tournament in 1950. The choice gave FIFA 4 years to rebuild the event after the canceled 1942 and 1946 editions. Europe was rebuilding cities, economies, and football systems. South America had escaped the physical devastation of the war and offered stadium crowds, established clubs, and the financial ambition to stage a global event. Brazil was the only declared candidate willing to carry the project at the decisive moment. Hosting, therefore, represented both opportunity and responsibility. The World Cup could return because Brazil was prepared to build around it. The symbolism was enormous. Football could not undo the previous decade, but it could reconnect people who had spent years divided by borders, occupation, and conflict. The tournament would include former enemies, old champions, new arrivals, and nations that still disagreed about FIFA's authority. The World Cup returned not because the world was healed, but because it wanted a ritual that looked like normal life. Brazil did not want to host quietly. Rio de Janeiro, then the national capital, planned a stadium that would announce the country's scale and confidence to the world. Construction began in August 1948 on the former Derby Club grounds. The location and public cost were politically contested. Critics argued that the city was spending too much and building in the wrong place. Supporters, led publicly by journalist Mario Filho, presented the project as a democratic monument large enough for every social class to enter. The stadium was still unfinished when it opened on June 16, 1950. Scaffolding, exposed sections, and incomplete facilities did not prevent tens of thousands from entering. 8 days later, Brazil played Mexico there in the World Cup opener and won 4-0. The building's enormous bowl made spectators part of the image. The team was no longer performing in front of a crowd. It was playing inside a physical expression of national expectation. The Maracana was preparation, infrastructure, and propaganda at once. It suggested a modern Brazil capable of completing a project no European country could then match, yet its scale also raised the emotional risk. When nearly 200,000 people share one expectation, hope becomes pressure. The stadium was designed to hold a celebration. By the end of the tournament, it would hold something much more complicated. FIFA planned for 16 teams. Only 13 arrived. Some absences reflected money and travel. Turkey withdrew under financial pressure. Scotland qualified by finishing second in the British Home Championship, but its association had declared that the team would travel only as British champion. England finished first, and Scottish officials refused the place their players had earned. France accepted a late invitation and then withdrew after seeing a schedule that demanded enormous travel across Brazil. India's absence produced one of football's most persistent myths. India had qualified after its regional opponents withdrew, and several Indian players had competed barefoot at the 1948 Olympics. The popular story says FIFA banned them because they refused to wear boots. Contemporary explanations point instead to cost, preparation, selection priorities, and the Indian Federation's limited understanding of the World Cup's importance. The barefoot detail was real. The simple cause and effect story was not. Argentina also stayed away amid tensions with Brazilian football authorities, while several strong Eastern European nations did not enter. The result was a competition with uneven groups, 2 groups of 4, 1 group of 3, and Uruguay's group containing only 2 teams. The World Cup was alive again, but it remained fragile, expensive, and shaped by decisions made far from the field. Italy arrived as the 2-time defending champion, but the team that had ruled before the war no longer existed. On May 4, 1949, an aircraft carrying Torino home from Lisbon crashed into the hill at Superga. The Grande Torino side, which supplied the core of the national team, was destroyed. Players, coaches, staff, journalists, and crew were killed. Italian football entered mourning, and its strongest generation disappeared in a single afternoon. The trauma affected the journey to Brazil. Italy traveled by ship rather than fly across the Atlantic. The voyage gave the rebuilt squad time together, but it also limited preparation and reportedly cost footballs kicked overboard during training. The defending champion lost its opening match 3-2 to Sweden and was eliminated despite beating Paraguay. This was not simply a sporting decline, it was a team trying to represent continuity after losing the people who had embodied it. The episode reveals what the 12-year gap meant. The labels from 1938 survived. Italy was still champion, FIFA still had a trophy, and national flags returned to the stadium. The human reality underneath those labels had changed completely. Brazil 1950 did not pick up where France 1938 ended. It began in a different world carrying the names of an older one. England entered the World Cup for the first time. The British associations had spent years outside FIFA, confident that the country which codified the game did not need an international tournament to prove its authority. By 1950, they had returned, and England arrived with celebrated professionals such as Billy Wright, Tom Finney, Stan Mortensen, and Stanley Matthews. The United States arrived with a hastily assembled group of part-time players whose ordinary jobs became part of the legend. In Belo Horizonte, England attacked constantly. It hit the woodwork and forced goalkeeper Frank Borghi into repeated saves. In the 38th minute, Walter Barr crossed and Haitian-born Joe Gaetjens redirected the ball past Bert Williams. The United States defended the lead and won 1-0. It remains one of the World Cup's defining upsets. The story is often presented as professionals losing to amateurs, which captures the surprise but misses the wider change. International football was becoming a place where institutional prestige did not guarantee control. England could possess deeper tradition, famous clubs, and superior resources, and still lose a single match to disciplined opponents with one decisive moment. England then lost 1-0 to Spain and went home after the group stage. The nation that believed it had taught the world football had discovered that the world had been practicing. Brazil opened by beating Mexico 4-0, with Ademir scoring twice. The result matched the national mood, but the second match complicated everything. Against Switzerland in Sao Paulo, coach Flavio Costa changed the lineup to include players familiar to the local crowd. Brazil led twice and drew 2-2. The host was criticized for regional compromise and tactical uncertainty. Suddenly, advancement depended on beating Yugoslavia. Before that decisive group match, Yugoslav forward Ratko Mladic struck his head on metalwork near the Maracana tunnel and required treatment. Brazil took the field while Yugoslavia began with 10 men. Ademir scored before Mladic returned, and Zizinho later made it 2-0. Brazil advanced, but the route was not the effortless march later memory suggests. The team's strength came from a fluid attack. Ademir accelerated through the center and finished quickly. Jair supplied imagination. Zizinho connected midfield to the forwards with the intelligence that later made him one of Pelé's heroes. Brazil played in white shirts with blue trim, not the yellow that would eventually become inseparable from its identity. In 1950, the visual language of Brazilian football was still being written. Brazil 1950 remains the only World Cup without a knockout final. The 4 first-round group winners entered another round-robin group. Each played 3 matches. 2 points were awarded for a win, 1 for a draw, and the team with the most points became champion. Brazil, Spain, Sweden, and Uruguay reached this final stage. The format mattered because Brazil against Uruguay on July 16th was technically the final match of a league, not a designated final. Sweden and Spain played at the same time, yet the table created a final in everything but name. Brazil entered on 4 points. Uruguay had 3. A Brazilian win or draw would deliver the title. Uruguay had to win. That distinction makes the ending more dramatic, not less. Brazil possessed 2 ways to become champion and home advantage inside the largest stadium on earth. Uruguay possessed 1 narrow path. The tournament's strange structure had reduced an uneven competition to the clearest possible equation. Brazil entered the final round and became overwhelming. It beat Sweden 7-1 with Ademir scoring 4. Then it defeated Spain 6-1. 13 goals in 2 games against European group winners transformed confidence into certainty. Ademir would finish the tournament with 9 goals, the highest total at any World Cup to that point. The Spain match became a cultural performance. As Brazil pulled away, the Maracana crowd sang "Turadas in Madrid," a popular song that turned victory into carnival. Radio carried the celebration beyond Rio. Newspapers described a team that seemed to combine technique, speed, and national character. The host was not merely winning, it appeared to be discovering the future of football in public. This is the emotional trap at the center of 1950. Brazil's confidence was not invented from nothing. The team had supplied evidence: 13 goals, waves of attack, and a stadium that seemed to push opponents backward. But evidence became prophecy. The final match was discussed as though Uruguay's role was to attend Brazil's ceremony. Once a sporting outcome becomes a national promise, the opponent gains an opportunity more dangerous than tactics. It gains freedom. Uruguay had played only 1 first-round match because its group collapsed to 2 teams. It beat Bolivia 8-0, then entered the final round without having faced sustained pressure. Against Spain, Uruguay came from behind to draw 2-2. Against Sweden, it trailed twice before Oscar Miguez scored 2 late goals in a 3-2 victory. The team was less spectacular than Brazil, but increasingly difficult to finish. At its center stood Captain Obdulio Varela, a powerful midfielder and organizer who understood the emotional contest as clearly as the tactical one. Around him were goalkeeper Roque Maspoli, defender Schubert Gambetta, playmaker Juan Schiaffino, forward Miguez, and right-winger Alcides Ghiggia. Uruguay also carried a national memory Brazil did not yet possess. It had won Olympic titles in 1924 and 1928, and the first World Cup in 1930. The popular dressing room story says, Coach Juan Lopez instructed caution. Then Varela told the players to reject fear and attack. The exact dialogue has been polished by decades of retelling, but Uruguay's behavior supports the larger point. It did not enter the Maracana trying to survive 90 minutes. It pressed when possible, protected the center, and looked for Ghiggia on the right. Uruguay respected Brazil's talent without accepting Brazil's destiny. On the morning of July 16th, Rio prepared for victory. The newspaper O Mundo published a photograph of Brazil with a headline presenting the players as world champions. Celebrations were planned, speeches were ready. Rio's mayor addressed the team before kickoff as victors without equals. The confidence reached Uruguay's camp, where Varela reportedly used Brazilian newspapers as provocation. Some details of the day have become folklore. Varela buying copies, placing them on a bathroom floor, and ordering teammates to trample them. Jules Rimet preparing only a speech congratulating Brazil. Medals already carrying Brazilian names. The safest historical approach is to separate the documented atmosphere from every perfect anecdote. Brazil was overwhelmingly favored. Public messaging assumed victory. Uruguay noticed. The pressure was not shared equally. Uruguay could become immortal by disrupting the event. Brazil could make history only by fulfilling what everyone had already declared. Every minute without a Brazilian goal therefore worked in Uruguay's favor. The crowd's size, intended as Brazil's greatest advantage, could become a measure of anxiety. English referee George Reeder started the match before a crowd whose official number remains a World Cup record. Brazil attacked from the opening minutes. Ademir, Zizinho, Jair, and Friasa moved toward Maspoli's goal, but Uruguay compressed the center and forced hurried shots. At the other end, Ghiggia repeatedly tested left-back Bigode with direct runs. The first half ended 0-0. On the scoreboard, Brazil was still champion. Emotionally, the match was changing. A team that had scored 13 goals in 2 games had spent 45 minutes without one. Uruguay had survived the opening wave and proved that the stadium could not score by itself. Varela's leadership was visible in the pace of the game. He challenged, organized, and delayed restarts when Uruguay needed air. This was not beautiful football in the way Brazil's previous victories had been beautiful. It was intelligent resistance. Uruguay was turning a national festival back into a football match. 2 minutes after halftime, Brazil finally broke through. Friasa ran on to Ademir's pass and shot beyond Maspoli. The Maracana released everything it had been holding. Brazil led 1-0 and now required Uruguay to score twice. Varela picked up the ball and walked toward the referee. He argued that the goal was offside and demanded attention from the linesman. He later acknowledged that delay was the purpose. The protest could not erase the goal, but it could interrupt the emotional force that followed it. By the time play restarted, teammates could hear instructions again. It is one of the most intelligent acts of game management in World Cup history. Varela recognized that Uruguay was facing 2 opponents, 11 players, and a wave of sound. He could not remove Brazil's lead. He could make the match small again. The stadium had expected the first goal to open the floodgates. Instead, it became the point where Uruguay's belief hardened. In the 66th minute, Ghiggia beat Bigode on the right and sent the ball across the penalty area. Schiaffino arrived and drove it high past Barbosa. 1-1. Brazil still held the title on the table, but the emotional balance had reversed. Uruguay had found a repeatable path down the right, and Brazil could no longer treat the clock as a friend. 13 minutes later, Ghiggia attacked the same space. Barbosa had seen the equalizer arrive as a cross and positioned himself to intercept another. Ghiggia looked toward the middle, then struck low toward the near post. The shot passed Barbosa and entered the goal. 2-1 Uruguay. Goalkeeping analysis can identify the risk. Barbosa left a gap at the near post because he anticipated the cross. But the goal also belonged to Ghiggia's deception, speed, and courage. He made the goalkeeper choose, then punish the choice. Reducing the moment to one man's error erases the winger who created it and the team that had prepared the pattern. Brazil attacked through the remaining minutes, but Uruguay held. Reeder blew the final whistle. Ghiggia later said that only 3 people had silenced the Maracana: the Pope, Frank Sinatra, and him. The line endured because it describes what footage and photographs cannot fully reproduce. Nearly 200,000 people did not disappear. Their certainty did. There was no prepared stage for Uruguay's celebration. Jules Rimet later described finding himself on the field amid confusion, carrying the trophy and looking for Varela. The formal speech he expected to deliver was useless. Uruguay's captain received the cup in a ceremony swallowed by the stunned crowd. Uruguay had become champion for the second time in 2 appearances. It had not entered the tournaments of 1934 or 1938, so the country remained unbeaten across its first 2 World Cups. The title connected Varela's generation to José Nasazzi, José Andrade, and the pioneers of 1930. A country of roughly 2 million people had defeated the host inside the largest football crowd ever assembled. For Brazil, the result was technically a runner-up finish in a 4-team table. That language could not contain the experience. The team had scored 22 goals in 6 matches. Ademir led the tournament in scoring. Brazil had produced its finest World Cup performance to date. One defeat transformed all of it into a national wound. Goalkeeper Moacir Barbosa carried the heaviest part of the defeat. He was one of Brazil's finest keepers, a Copa America champion, and a major figure for Vasco da Gama. After 1950, his career and identity were repeatedly reduced to Ghiggia's shot. Barbosa later described living under a sentence for a crime he did not commit. The scapegoating cannot be separated from race. Barbosa was a black goalkeeper in a society whose football culture carried racial hierarchies, even while celebrating black attacking stars. Academic studies of his treatment connect the memory of 1950 to a lasting distrust of black Brazilian goalkeepers. Brazil lost as a team, yet criticism concentrated on Barbosa and defender Bigode, another black player, in ways that reveal more than tactical disappointment. This does not mean every criticism of the near-post goal was racist. Goalkeepers are judged by decisive actions, and Barbosa expected to save it. The journalistic obligation is to hold 2 truths together. The shot was costly, and the lifetime punishment was grotesquely disproportionate. A nation turned one sporting choice into a moral verdict because blaming a person was easier than accepting uncertainty. Brazil's white shirt also became associated with defeat. In 1953, the newspaper Correio da Manhã sponsored a competition for a new design using all 4 colors of the national flag. Aldir Garcia Schlee created the yellow shirt, green trim, blue shorts, and white socks that became the most recognizable national kit in football. The change is often told as an instant reaction on the night of the Maracanazo. It was not. 3 years passed and the new identity emerged through a public design process. That slower history matters. Brazil did not erase 1950 with one decision. It rebuilt its football image, argued about style and selection, and carried the defeat into future tournaments. 8 years later, Brazil would win its first World Cup in Sweden wearing yellow, led by a 17-year-old Pelé. The temptation is to treat 1950 as a necessary tragedy that automatically created 1958. History is not that neat. The defeat did not guarantee success. It became one of the pressures through which Brazilian football reconsidered itself. Brazil 1950 returned the World Cup to the world. It introduced England and humbled it. It honored Italian champions while revealing the human cost hidden behind that title. It gave Ademir 9 goals, built the Maracana, and showed how radio, newspapers, architecture, and politics could turn 11 players into symbols for an entire country. Uruguay won because it refused to perform the role Brazil had assigned it. Varela controlled emotion. Ghiggia created both goals. Schiaffino finished the first. Maspoli and the defense survived the pressure. Their victory was not a supernatural curse or a Brazilian collapse without cause. It was one team executing a brave plan inside the most hostile atmosphere imaginable. The silence of the Maracana did not prove that football had failed to unite people. It proved how completely football had united their attention. Joy and grief traveled through the same crowd at the same instant. The World Cup had returned from 12 years of darkness and immediately reminded everyone why it mattered. No government, newspaper, stadium, or favorite can decide the ending in advance. Brazil built the stage. Uruguay wrote the ending. End card. Next, Episode 5, Switzerland, 1954, The Miracle of Bern.